The bloody battles of the Western Front in 1916 proved a harsh lesson. In the early years of the First World War, even when you won, you lost. For a handful of kilometers, or often just a few hundred meters, both sides paid with oceans of blood. Hundreds of thousands killed or mutilated by bullets and shellfire, and a steadily worsening shortage of men. British, French, and German commanders recognized the stalemate and began hunting for new methods, bracing for yet another year of combat. One ambitious French general intended to test every such method in the field, convinced that a single decisive strike could end the war. By early 1917, after 2.5 years of struggle, the Western Front had hardly moved. The Germans retained most of their early war gains from 1914 to 1915 and had inflicted dreadful losses on the British and the French, but they too were running out of manpower. In late 1916, Chief of the Admiralty Henning von Holtzendorf warned the Chancellor that a decision had to be forced by the autumn of 1917. Otherwise, the war would end in general exhaustion for all parties, a disastrous outcome for Germany. The Entente also wanted 1917 to be the year of decision. France, which fielded a larger army than Britain, planned a sweeping, multi-front offensive designed to push the Germans out of France. In November 1916, Commander-in-Chief Joseph Joffre laid out a concept that combined offensives on the Italian and Russian fronts with a major Franco-British push in the West. Britain's new Prime Minister David Lloyd George dismissed the idea as a complete farce, a repetition of the bloody follies of 1915 and 1916, throwing human bodies at the strongest fortresses in the enemy line. By January 1917, the situation had shifted. Russia and Italy were no longer able to mount a major offensive, and Joffre had been replaced by General Robert Nivelle. Buoyed by his success at Verdun, Nivelle preferred massive artillery preparation followed by infantry thrusts on narrow sectors, and he reshaped the plan along those lines. Nivelle envisioned a British diversion around Arras to draw off German reserves. Once the enemy was fixed in the north, the French would launch the main attack against the Noyon salient along the Chemin des Dames ridge. Nivelle expected a knockout blow. British commander Field Marshal Douglas Haig was alarmed by rumors that British forces might be placed under French command. He called that madness, insisting that British troops would not fight under French leadership. He even said he would face court-martial rather than betray the army by accepting it. Eventually, after threats of resignation on both sides, a compromise was struck. Britain's 1st, 3rd, and 5th armies would support the French attack but remain under British control. Haig also insisted on more time to prepare, moving the target date from February to April. So the Entente set April 1917 as the moment to break the stalemate on the Western Front. Yet the German Empire was also making plans that would make it far harder to beat. In 1914 and 1915, German doctrine favored the offensive, but the appalling losses of 1916 forced a rethink. The Entente could mostly replace casualties with fresh reserves and colonial troops. Germany could not. German leaders therefore accepted that a shift to the defensive in the West was necessary. In September 1916, Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg and General Erich Ludendorff took charge of the entire war effort and soon concluded that the situation in the West was extremely difficult. Staff Officer Hermann von Kuhl recorded a discussion to that effect. A large-scale positive outcome was no longer possible. Germany must hang out and seize the best chance for peace. Too many serious mistakes had been made in 1916. One of those mistakes was packing too many men into the frontline trenches where they were exposed to Allied artillery. The Germans responded by adopting elastic defense in depth, as set out in the December 1916 directive, Principles of Command in the Defensive Battle, in Position Warfare. Rather than holding the front line at any cost, defenders would allow the enemy to enter a deeper defensive system, divided into 3 belts. First came the forward zone, one or two lightly held trenches sufficient for raids and sniping, but to be abandoned if the Allies attacked in force. Next lay the main battle zone, the real line of resistance, with rebuilt trenches, reinforced strongpoints, buildings, bunkers, pillboxes, and obstacles. Behind it stood a rear battle zone with further trenches, support facilities, and units ready to counterattack. These troops were to wait until the attackers had exhausted themselves and outrun their artillery. This was the new elasticity: bend, withdraw, and snap back. The Germans also refined their use of terrain, especially reverse slopes. Machine guns placed just behind the crest had a shallower field of fire, but they could surprise attackers mid-slope and remained largely protected from enemy observation and artillery. German divisions were deployed differently as well, 3 regiments abreast, with battalions echeloned from front to rear, which simplified coordination, communication, withdrawal, and counterattack. The defense became a living system rather than a rigid wall. Perhaps the most dramatic change in the West was Operation Alberich, a major withdrawal across the Noyon salient in February and March 1917. German forces abandoned their extended forward line and fell back to the newly constructed Hindenburg Line, built to the new defensive principles. The line was also significantly shorter, up to 72 kilometers east in places, freeing 13 German divisions. When Entente patrols cautiously followed, they found that the Germans had destroyed or removed anything useful in their wake and littered the area with booby traps. A British officer recalled how explosive charges were attached to shell cases and grenades, so that an incautious kick could set them off. Several men were lost that way. The message was clear: nothing here could be trusted. As the Germans revised their tactics after Verdun and the Somme, the British Army also learned from its mistakes and sought new ways to break the deadlock. The 1916 fighting exposed shortfalls. Infantry often advanced in straight lines for the sake of cohesion and control, and were cut down because artillery had truly destroyed the defenses. When advancing troops came under fire, confusion and panic set in. Non-commissioned and junior officers waited for orders from above, but seniors were overwhelmed, killed, or out of contact. To counter this, British and Imperial units shifted toward small unit assault tactics at the platoon level, open formations, short rushes from cover to cover, and flanking enemy strongpoints to bring enfilade fire. The command hierarchy was decentralized, and junior leaders were encouraged to seize the initiative. Canadian Corps Commander Lieutenant General Julian Byng reminded his officers, "The man who does something may sometimes be wrong, but the man who does nothing is always wrong." New weapons began reaching British frontline units. In 1916, platoons often lacked the firepower to hold captured trenches against German counterattacks. In 1917, they gained specially trained bombers and rifle grenade teams, as well as 1 light Lewis machine gun per roughly 60 men. Heavy machine guns were used in the assault to lay down suppressive fire. British reports also criticized the artillery of 1916. On the Somme, barrages were spread along too wide a front and failed to crush the defenses, especially targets beyond the first trench line, such as enemy artillery. Faulty ammunition meant many dud shells, and older fuses did not detonate on impact, so wire remained uncut. In 1917, the British introduced the instantaneous No. 106 fuse and improved coordination between gunners and observers, especially aircraft. Counter-battery fire became a priority, aided by flash spotting and sound ranging. The creeping barrage was synchronized more precisely. If on the Somme, 1 gun covered about 50 meters of front, at Arras it was closer to 20. Underground warfare expanded too, digging tunnels beneath no man's land to mine German positions and subways to move troops to the jumping-off trenches under cover. On 9 April 1917, the British diversionary offensive opened, the Battle of Arras. 18 divisions, 3,000 guns, and dozens of tanks went over the top. What went right and what went wrong in the fighting that followed? In the opening stage near Vimy Ridge, the Canadian Corps achieved one of the most successful Allied actions of the campaign. The Germans had fortified the ridge, which dominated the surrounding ground, but the Canadians, supported by British infantry and artillery, captured most of it in a single day. British and Canadian guns smashed German positions, allowing the Canadians, using new small-unit tactics, to take the first lines quickly. Fresh Canadian units then leapfrogged through the tired first wave and pushed on to the next objectives. Shell-shocked and disorganized survivors surrendered in large numbers, about 4,000 on day one. 17-year-old Herman Kraft, one of those captured, later left a fanciful account of this surrender, claiming he met a fearsome Red Indian among his Canadian captors. The image was almost certainly imagined, but it reveals the shock of the moment. By the end of 9 April, nearly the entire ridge was in Canadian hands. A great deal had gone right for the Canadians. The revised tactics allowed a rapid advance, and counter-battery fire had neutralized much of the German artillery, with roughly 83% of the enemy gun positions identified before the assault. Canadian infantry, like Private Bill Tapper of the 38th Battalion, praised the supporting fire, quipping that the Germans were beaten before the Canadians arrived. In reality, Vimy Ridge was far from a walkover, but the Germans compounded their problems. They were unable to fully implement elastic defense in depth here, and reserves were positioned too far back to counterattack while they still had time. The loss of such a position did not bode well for the German army. South of Arras, near the village of Bullecourt, the Australians and New Zealanders had a much rougher experience. Fifth Army Commander General Hubert Gough was impatient to get the Anzac Corps into action, but artillery support was delayed. He decided to rely on a dozen tanks to spearhead the attack along a 1-kilometer front and crush the wire that shells had not yet cut. Preparation time was short. The tanks moved out before dawn on 11 April. They knocked out some German machine gun posts, but most bogged down or were knocked out before they reached the wire. "Come on, boys, bugger the tanks," Major Percy Black reportedly shouted as the infantry went forward alone. Where they broke in, they lacked the strength to push farther. German strongpoints, especially the village itself, raked the Australians from the flanks. Exhausted, exposed, and with their lines of retreat cut in places, the Anzacs were forced back to their start line. The assault failed. What went wrong? Gough's impatience produced inadequate preparation, and there was poor communication with the artillery, which sometimes assumed that certain positions had fallen when they had not. Australian reports blamed the tanks. Some crews lacked knowledge of the infantry plan. One commander had not even synchronized his watch and was 5 minutes behind the infantry timetable. Others were unsure of the direction to the enemy. Of the 11 tanks committed, only 2 survived. On the German side, unlike at Vimy, defense in depth held. Strong points like Bullecourt poured fire into the flanks of the attackers, and counterattacks landed at just the right moment. So the British offensive around Arras in April 1917 recorded a bright success at Vimy Ridge and a painful setback at Bullecourt. But it was, after all, a diversion. The main Allied effort was aimed at the Aisne sector. Even though the Germans had shortened their line in March, Nivelle's offensive went ahead. The French plan involved 3 army groups, 2/3 of the French forces in the west. The Reserve Army Group would lead the assault, with the Central and Northern groups mounting secondary attacks. 2 armies of the Reserve Group would break the line in the Aisne sector within 24 to 48 hours. A third would then pass through as the master maneuver, unleashing mobile operations in the German rear. Nivelle intended to use his Verdun recipe, but on a grand scale. Narrow penetrations, overwhelming artillery, and relentless momentum. Morale and offensive spirit, he believed, would overcome obstacles. Once the German line was broken, the flanks could be rolled up. French tactics continued, but the emphasis was now on firepower. The ratio of light machine guns rose to 16 per 250 men. Although Nivelle was skeptical about tanks, the reserve group received around 160 Schneiders and 16 Chemins. But the main bet was artillery. About 6,100 guns were in position by January. The creeping barrage was to move faster to speed the breakthrough and, critically, the maneuver phase that would follow. As April approached, doubts grew among Nivelle's own subordinates, especially General Joseph Michelet, commander of the Reserve Army Group. He pointed out that the German withdrawal had changed the battlefield, but Nivelle insisted it made little difference. General Philippe Pétain questioned the effect of concentrated but localized shelling over such a broad front. He joked that even Lake Geneva would have little effect if poured over the Sahara Desert. Most worrying, evidence mounted that the Germans knew an attack was coming. Nivelle had a reputation for lax operational security, and on 4 April, German forces captured documents revealing French plans. Despite these misgivings, Nivelle ordered the offensive to begin on 16 April, promising to halt it if there was no breakthrough within 48 hours, though he himself expected 3 would suffice. Following a 14-day preparatory barrage, the 5th and 6th Armies of the Reserve Group attacked a 40-kilometer front around the Chemin. Following a 14-day preparatory barrage, the 5th and 6th Armies of the Reserve Group attacked a 40-kilometer front around the Chemin des Dames at 6 a.m. on 16 April 1917. They captured the first line and reached the ridge within the first hour. Then the German defenses tore into them, uncut wire, concrete emplacements, and disciplined machine gun teams. The Senegalese troops of the 10th Colonial Division were hit especially hard. An entire battalion was almost wiped out when it ran into reverse slope positions, just as German doctrine intended. A corps commander described how infantry descending into the valleys were fixed in place by fire from positions beyond the crest outside the reach of French shells. Leaders fell within minutes. Units that could not cross the killing ground took cover or fell back. The second French wave then moved in, only to become entangled with the retreating first wave. Tanks helped capture the village of Juvincourt, but presented large targets and many were knocked out. Where the French did advance, they often had to stop because neighboring units were held and the flanks were open. By the end of the first day, troops were forced to dig in under dreadful conditions, and morale, especially among colonial units, plummeted. The French tried again in the following days, and they took more than 5,000 German prisoners, but by 20th April, both sides knew the offensive had failed. German officer Hermann von Kuhl would later write that the first 2 days had decided its fate. If the breakthrough did not come immediately, it would never come. Many things had gone wrong for the French. The weather was abysmal, slowing the advance and preventing aerial observation. In April 1917, the Germans enjoyed practical air superiority, Bloody April, which limited French spotting. The defenders had been reinforced, sometimes doubling the number of divisions as French intelligence had reported. Where the creeping barrage did move, it often went too fast and left the infantry exposed. In some places, the Germans repaired wire before the assault arrived. Vast tunnel networks under the ridge protected garrisons from the 11 million shells fired. Since French command expected a short battle, ammunition stocks ran dry faster than planned, reducing artillery support precisely when it was needed most. Above all, elastic defense performed as designed. French troops ran into timed counterattacks and measured withdrawals that robbed them of tempo. The Chemin des Dames offensive fizzled into May. Approximately 134,000 French soldiers were killed and tens of thousands mutinied. Nivelle's promised war-winning blow had failed. The British contribution, though locally successful at times, did not draw enough German reserves away from the Aisne. The battles of Arras and the Aisne began with gains but ended as attritional fights. The Allies could seize more ground than in 1916, yet they had not solved the riddle of trench warfare. Nivelle was replaced in May and has drawn particular criticism for the failure. He has been accused of wearing strategic blinkers and inability to deviate from a long-established plan when new information came to light. After arguing for months with Haig and with his own colleagues, he defended his scheme against alterations. When informed of German reinforcements, he reputedly replied that victory would be all the more impressive. Lloyd George, who had supported Nivelle in the past, later changed his mind, saying that the cool planner of December had become a reckless plunger by April. To be fair, had the operation gone ahead in February as Nivelle originally wanted, it might have fared better. Surprise would have been greater, and the Germans would still have been overstretched in the Noyon salient before their withdrawal. But perhaps most damaging was Nivelle's assumption that the enemy was a passive obstacle rather than an active opponent with initiative. He expected Germans to behave as they had at Verdun in 1916, yet by 1917 they had changed. Nivelle learned, the hard way, that the enemy always gets a vote. For historians, this episode is more than industrial tonnages and barrages. It is an evolution of military thought. Arras and the Chemin show the emergence of what later generations would call modern tactics: assault by sections, suppressive fire, layered defense, counter-battery science, and the decisive role of terrain, weather, time, and human judgment. Even the boldest plan breaks if it ignores any of these. Slow, bloody tactical engineering laid the road to subsequent breakthroughs and to insights later wars would refine. To sum up, the spring of 1917 on the Western Front was a paradox of hopes and realities. Entente artillery became more precise, infantry more flexible, coordination with aircraft improved, tanks were tried and their limits exposed. Germany, forced off the grand offensives of 1914-15, built a defense able to absorb a blow and snap back. There was no decisive cascade in April, but the lessons of Vimy, Arras, the Aisne, and the Chemin des Dames would shape future Allied operations, from choosing the ground and the hour to assigning roles within a platoon. A final note on sources and the media dimension. Military history storytelling on mass platforms walks a narrow line. Rules about advertiser friendliness change, and creators never know when trenches, artillery, and casualty talk will trip a filter. That is why some migrate to alternative venues where they can publish long-form material. World War II series, operations in the Rhineland, and indeed deep dives into 1917 without fear of demonetization. Credit goes to researchers and advisors whose everyday work underpins narratives like this one. To strengthen the through line, we can revisit the strategic environment that fed Nivelle's confidence. Public and political pressure in London and Paris was intense. The front stood still, resources ran down, and a transformative blow was demanded. The combined front idea, coordinated attacks in several theaters, was not new, but in 1917, railways, telephones, and industrial artillery finally made its timing plausible. Yet even a perfect schedule could not overcome weather, terrain, and the enemy's own reforms. Success would hinge on hours and minutes, not on slogans. Germany's turn to defense was not a confession of weakness so much as an admission that the balance had changed. Campaigns in 1916 taught that frontal offensives without decisive superiority drained strength without delivering decision. Hindenburg and Ludendorff standardized depth, flexibility, and economy of force. The goal was to make the attacker spend himself in the forward zones, then meet him with hard points and counterstrokes. In form and in spirit, the front became a spring rather than a stone wall. Operation Alberich was a feat of engineering and logistics. Demolitions, burned stores, torn rails, fouled wells, mined roads. It slowed pursuit and poisoned soldiers' trust in anything left behind. A tin, a bottle, a shell case, each might kill. Meanwhile, the shortened line freed precious divisions for a mobile reserve, the keystone of elastic defense. British changes in 1917 required a revolution in training. Practice grounds recreated German defenses, concrete boxes, interlocking fields of fire, and multi-layered wire. Assault sections trained for specific roles: grenadiers to clear, Lewis gun pairs to suppress, rifle grenadiers to hit defilated points, and sappers to open lanes. The sergeant's role expanded dramatically. He was expected to read the ground and outflank strongpoints without waiting for orders. What later textbooks call fire and maneuver took shape here. Artillery's emblematic innovation was the 106 fuse, a small, sensitive nose that detonated on contact and shredded wire instead of digging harmless craters. Counter-battery warfare turned systematic. Flash-spotting teams triangulated gun flashes. Sound-ranging arrays captured the audio signatures of batteries. Airmen, when weather allowed, corrected maps. The data flowed to firing plans that gunners received just before 0 hour. But without clear skies, much of that science faltered. Tunneling under no man's land served multiple tasks at once: demolishing strongpoints, masking the approach, and protecting logistics. Subways delivered companies to their start lines dry and intact, unseen by enemy observers. At zero, a good plan felt like clockwork. The creeping barrage stepped forward in measured bounds. Assault groups kept within a few dozen meters. Runners and phone lines carried orders. Colored flares signaled progress. The Vimy attack stood out for discipline and synchronization. Platoon maps showed not only trench lines but also feints, dead-end connectors, supply alcoves, and approaches to machine gun nests. When the first wave tired, the second wave jumped through and kept pushing, not allowing the defense to reset. Enemy batteries were smothered to the extent weather allowed. Pre-battle work had located most of them. There was nothing romantic about the labor. Men dug, howled, and cleared cellars under fire. Victory was measured in meters. Bullecourt, by contrast, revealed what happened when the cogs failed to mesh. Tanks in 1917 were slow, fragile, and blind. Without careful reconnaissance and tight artillery integration, they became targets on tracks. When the steel halted, infantry faced live wire and had to cut by hand under machine gun fire, the image of futile frontal attack. In foggy orders and unsynced watches, small errors multiplied. Uncut belts, living bunkers, counters from the flanks. For the Germans, it was a case study in how defense should work. Chemin des Dames demonstrated how a tactical method can falter at the operational scale. The Verdun formula was designed for tight, time-bound battles. Transferred to a 40-kilometer arc without secrecy and in bad weather that blinded the gunners, it broke down. French waves pushed forward, but reverse slopes and concrete casements turned each valley into a killing bowl. In the second wave, the classic friction of war took over. Units mixed, officers fell, telephones died, and momentum dissipated. Colonial formations, Senegalese in particular, suffered disproportionate losses, which hammered morale. Tanks that were supposed to add impetus bogged or burned. Stocks of ammunition, calculated for a short, sharp operation, dwindled as the fight dragged. Germans rationed their withdrawals and picked their counterattacks, never allowing local success to turn into operational breakthrough. The result was a frozen line and terrible casualties. The aftermath was a crisis of trust inside the French army. The mutinies of May 1917 were not treason, but a protest against what soldiers saw as purposeless slaughter. Command changed hands, and the emphasis shifted from decisive blow to methodical bite and hold with thrift in infantry lives. Paradoxically, these lessons would help later when fresh opportunities arose in 1918. Criticism of Nivelle clusters around several points. First, communication. A grand design without disciplined secrecy leaks away its surprise. Second, blindness to a changed enemy, assuming the Germans would react as last year. Third, tempo. Either the creeping barrage ran too fast or the calendar allowed no room for a grind. Finally, the human factor. Morale and fatigue remain decisive, even when the map promises neat arrows. On the other hand, it is honest to admit that a February start under full surprise might have fared better. In the Noyon salient, the German rearrangement was not yet complete. Reserves were thinner. The shock of concentrated fire could have had greater effect. Yet even then, stabilization was likely. Elastic defense was designed to let the front bend without breaking. When we say artillery got better, we should not romanticize the progress. Better maps, better fuses, better signal plans also meant greater reliance on weather. Clouds cut observation, rain turned roads to grease, wind blew smoke the wrong way. In such conditions, even the cleverest staff work met mud in which tracks spun, cables snapped, and horses floundered. No less important was the evolution of infantry thinking. From lines to sections was not merely new geometry, it was a new psychology. The soldier had to navigate, seize angles, cover a comrade, lob a grenade at the right arc, and peel back if a machine gun opened on the flank. The platoon commander had to decide in seconds without calling headquarters. That fabric of flexibility would become a standard of 20th century armies. Ultimately, the spring of 1917 offered no magic wand. It became a laboratory that left behind the formulas of later victories and the mistakes that would not be repeated. The British and Canadians at Vimy showed that careful planning and tight infantry-artillery choreography could work. The Germans proved that a well-prepared defense could dullen the blow and reclaim initiative. The French army endured a painful reorganization that birthed a doctrine more cautious with lives and broader in tools. Finally, memory. The battles of 1917 are often overshadowed by the dramatic events of 1918, offensives and revolutions. Yet on the Chemin Ridge and the hills of Arras, in tunnels and in wind, the toolbox of later decisions was forged. These months warn us against miracle plans, teach respect for defense, and price the value of time.